October 25th, 1944. 3:52 in the morning, in the utterly black waters of Surigao Strait, the southern approach to the Philippine island of Leyte. Aboard the Japanese battleship Yamashiro, Admiral Shoji Nishimura is steering directly into what will turn out to be the last major battleship engagement in the recorded history of naval warfare. He does not know this yet. He knows only that his lookouts, using the finest night optics ever mounted aboard a warship, have reported nothing on the black horizon ahead. His own surface search radar, when consulted, shows nothing conclusive either. He believes he still has time to close the range and let his crews do the work they have spent a decade perfecting. Then, at exactly 3:53, a chain of 1-ton armor-piercing shells begins arriving out of the darkness from a distance of nearly 13 miles away. Yamashiro's gunners cannot see the ships firing at them. Her fire control officers cannot range them. Her lookouts are still watching an empty horizon. And here is the specific detail no one aboard Yamashiro will live long enough to properly explain. The Americans shooting at them can already see everything. To understand why some of the most professionally trained naval officers on Earth ended that morning firing blindly into the dark, while American shells landed with surgical accuracy on ships they could not even locate, you have to go back not to Surigao, but to the summer of 1942, and to a specific piece of institutional pride that had by then become almost a religion inside the Imperial Japanese Navy. The Japanese fleet, at the outbreak of the Pacific War, was the finest night-fighting force in the world. This was not opinion. It was the deliberate product of 2 decades of unglamorous, patient, extraordinarily thorough preparation. Japanese destroyer captains had spent entire careers rehearsing night torpedo attacks against friendly fleets under blackout conditions. Their lookouts were selected specifically for exceptional night vision and then subjected to a training regimen that read, on paper, closer to a monastic discipline than a military assignment. Diets high in vitamin A, long weekly sessions in blacked-out rooms adapting the eyes to total darkness. Specialized 15-centimeter binoculars mounted on gimbals, larger and more powerful than any equivalent optical instrument fielded by any Western Navy. A lookout aboard a Japanese cruiser in 1942 could routinely spot a darkened warship at ranges Western observers simply could not match. The doctrine those lookouts fed into was equally polished. The Type 93 torpedo, driven by pure oxygen rather than compressed air, could travel more than 20 miles at 40 knots, carrying a warhead half again the size of anything the Americans possessed. Japanese destroyers were trained to close in silence, fire at ranges American captains genuinely did not believe possible, and vanish back into the dark before their targets even understood they had been engaged. On the night of August 9, 1942, off the volcanic island of Savo, just north of Guadalcanal, Admiral Gunichi Mikawa demonstrated the entire package in less than 40 minutes. 4 Allied heavy cruisers went to the bottom. Roughly 1,000 Allied sailors died. Mikawa lost no ships at all. It was the worst open-water engagement the United States Navy would fight in the entire Pacific War. The lesson American commanders drew from Savo Island was not the one Japanese doctrine expected them to draw. The Japanese analysis assumed the Americans would train harder, build better optics, drill their lookouts more rigorously, essentially climb the same skill ladder Japan had already climbed 20 years earlier. The Americans instead decided to abandon the ladder entirely. 3 months after Savo, on the night of November 14, 1942, the American battleship Washington caught the Japanese battleship Kirishima in the same waters off Guadalcanal. The 2 ships were nearly evenly matched in every measurable category: tonnage, main battery, armor. In terms of night-fighting experience and lookout skill, Kirishima's crew was significantly the more polished of the 2. It made no difference at all. Washington's SG radar located Kirishima at 18,000 yards. Her Mark 8 fire control radar, an instrument almost no Japanese officer of the period had ever heard the name of, tracked Kirishima's exact position and firing solution continuously as she closed the range. When Washington opened fire at 8,400 yards, Kirishima was still fumbling with her searchlights, still trying to visually identify what her lookouts had reported. In the next 7 minutes, Washington fired 75 16-inch shells. 9 landed. Hiroshima was sinking before her captain fully understood which direction the shells had come from. The pattern that began that night would repeat itself with increasing regularity across the following 2 years. Cape Esperance, Vela Gulf, Empress Augusta Bay, Cape St. George. Names most Americans have never heard, each one a night engagement in which superbly trained Japanese crews were destroyed by American formations they never clearly saw. At Vela Gulf in August 1943, Captain Frederick Moosbrugger's 6 destroyers fired torpedoes at 3 Japanese destroyers from ranges the Japanese lookouts, watching intently, never detected the Americans at. All 3 Japanese ships sank. Not one American ship took a hit. At Cape St. George 3 months later, Captain Arleigh Burke's squadron did essentially the same to a different Japanese destroyer force, executing the entire engagement so cleanly that Burke's own after-action report reads more like a training exercise than a battle. Japanese officers captured across this period, when asked to explain what had actually happened to their ships, kept reaching for words meaning, roughly, incomprehensible. Not merely difficult to explain, but genuinely outside the categories their training had prepared them to think in at all. Here is what those officers could not see, and what most Western viewers today have not been shown either. The American advantage at Vela Gulf, at Empress Augusta Bay, at Surigao, was never simply a matter of possessing radar. The Japanese possessed radar too. The Type 22 surface search set, deployed on major Japanese warships from 1943 onward, was a functioning instrument. It was less accurate than the American SG, its range shorter, its resolution poorer, but it existed and it worked. If radar alone had been the story, the gap between the 2 navies would have been narrow. The gap was not narrow, it was categorical, and the reason had almost nothing to do with the radar sets themselves. The actual American innovation was a room. Deep inside every American warship of the mid-war period, the Navy had begun constructing a compartment called the Combat Information Center, universally shortened to CIC. It was a small, dimly lit space, usually below the main deck, filled with plotting tables, radar repeaters, radio circuits, and a rotating shift of enlisted men and junior officers whose job was neither to sight targets nor to fire guns. Their job was to see the battle. Every input the ship possessed, radar contacts, sonar contacts, radio traffic from other American ships, voice reports from lookouts, aircraft observations, was routed into that single room. Enlisted plotters, most of them men who a year earlier had been high school students or gas station attendants, translated those inputs onto illuminated grease pencil plots showing the position, course, and speed of every ship in the engagement, friendly and hostile. The captain on the bridge no longer had to construct the battle himself out of fragmentary sightings shouted up from various stations. He asked CIC for the picture, and CIC gave it to him already assembled. By 1943, American task force commanders were routinely receiving in the CIC a synthesized real-time view of a night engagement covering 40 or 50 miles of ocean in every direction, with every ship in that expanse labeled, tracked, and continuously updated. The fire control radar simultaneously fed the main battery an exact bearing and range solution accurate enough to hit a moving target at 15 miles in complete darkness on the first salvo. The Japanese Navy possessed no equivalent. There was no Japanese CIC. There was, in most cases, not even a coherent doctrine for combining radar contacts with visual sightings into a single tactical picture. Radar operators reported to one officer, lookouts to another, sonar to a third. The captain synthesized the picture in his own head from separately delivered reports, exactly as captains had done in the Age of Sail. The single most important American technical achievement of the Pacific War was not a piece of hardware at all. It was the decision to treat information itself as the primary weapon and to build an entirely new compartment inside every warship, specifically to process it. You might reasonably ask at this point why the Imperial Japanese Navy, having watched American formations dismantle its finest destroyer squadrons repeatedly across 1943, did not simply build its own version of CIC and its own version of the Mark 8. The answer is not that they lacked the engineers. Japanese optics, Japanese fire control computers, Japanese metallurgy across most of this period were world-class or nearly so. The answer sits somewhere much closer to the cultural bone of the institution itself. The Imperial Navy of the interwar period had built its identity around a very specific idea, that the warrior himself, the individually trained expert, was the irreducible core of military capability. The purpose of technology was to extend what a superbly trained man could already do. It was not to replace him or to make his particular skill obsolete. When mid-war Japanese officers examined the American approach, distributed sensor data flowing to a room full of ordinary sailors who then handed a synthesized picture to the captain, what they perceived was not a superior system. What they perceived was an abdication. The Americans, in their reading, had stopped trusting men and started trusting machines. This was, in the phrase that would recur in their own internal analyses, unworthy of a serious navy. Yamato Damashi, the Japanese spirit, sat at the center of the institution's self-image. A lookout with a decade of training and extraordinary night vision was, in the doctrine, worth more than any American gadget. The gadgets themselves, this reading concluded, were the symptom of a soft society that no longer produced real warriors and had to compensate with electronics. The result was that even when Japanese engineers produced perfectly capable radar sets, the officers who commanded the ships those sets were installed on frequently did not trust the readings, did not integrate them into fire control, and continued to rely on human observers even in engagements where the human observers, however well trained, could not possibly see what the radar could. Which returns us to 3:53 in the morning on October 25, 1944, and to Admiral Nishimura closing on an American battle line he still cannot see. The formation waiting for him at the northern end of Surigao Strait was commanded by Rear Admiral Jesse Oldendorf and included 6 American battleships, 5 of them survivors of the attack on Pearl Harbor 3 years earlier. Every one of those battleships mounted fire control radar. Every one operated an active combat information center. Oldendorf had positioned his battle line across the mouth of the strait in the classical maneuver naval officers had been training to execute for 400 years and had almost never actually achieved in combat, crossing the T. Nishimura was steaming directly into a wall of guns-oriented broadside to his line of advance. USS West Virginia, herself raised from the harbor bottom at Pearl, held Yamashiro on her Mark 8 radar for nearly 40 minutes before opening fire. Her plotters in CIC watched Nishimura's ships approach on the illuminated tables in complete confidence, tracking course and speed continuously. When the range fell to 22,800 yards, West Virginia's captain gave the order. Her first 8-gun salvo of 16-inch shells landed on Yamashiro at the first attempt. Tennessee and California, both Pearl Harbor survivors, joined immediately afterward. The Japanese battleship, still trying to identify what was happening, took repeated hits from ships whose muzzle flashes she could not clearly locate, across an ocean her lookouts insisted was empty. Within minutes she was on fire the full length of her superstructure. Within half an hour she was capsizing. Nishimura went down with his flagship, having never landed a single hit on any American battleship. Every one of those American battleships had, 3 years earlier, been sunk or damaged in the mud at Pearl Harbor. Not one of them had been the pride of the American fleet. What they possessed instead was the room below decks. The lesson buried inside those minutes off Surigao was never really a story about radar specifically. The Japanese officers who spent 1943 and 1944 losing engagements they could not explain had been raised inside a tradition that treated combat excellence as an individual property, refined through decades of personal training and preserved inside the body and mind of the warrior himself. The Americans had built something running on the opposite principle. They had decided that the ordinary sailor, given the right information at the right moment, could outperform the extraordinary warrior operating without it. They then constructed the entire infrastructure necessary to deliver that information reliably, in real time, to every gun on every ship in the fleet. Japan did not lose the night battles of the Pacific because Japanese sailors were less skilled than American sailors. They were, in most measurable individual respects, considerably more skilled. Japan lost those battles because the war Japan had trained for, the classical night engagement fought on lookout skill and torpedo doctrine and human courage in the dark, no longer existed. The Americans had quietly replaced it with a different war, one fought largely by teenagers in dim rooms below the waterline, translating radar returns into grease pencil plots and handing the captain the picture already assembled. Here is the question I'd genuinely be curious to hear you answer in the comments. If you had been a Japanese officer in early 1943, watching the first strange after-action reports come in from Vella Gulf, would you have understood what had actually happened? Or would you too have kept looking for the mistake somewhere in your lookouts training, exactly where your entire tradition had prepared you to look?